Thanks very much, Angelo. I changed the title of this paper last minute. It's now called Idealism, Realism and Success in Humanitarian Intervention. So I'm picking up on humanity.
Very similar.
Very similar. Well, I'll be touching on similar themes. So thanks very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be here, and thanks everyone for still being here. The good news is what I'm going to say isn't particularly conceptually or philosophically dense, so it's going to be a nice, easy paper to finish off the day. Okay, so as the title suggests, I'm talking about the success principle in relation to armed humanitarian intervention. And I want to start off with the 2001 report of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. It's called the Responsibility to Protect. The R2P document sets out a list of conditions that must be satisfied before armed humanitarian intervention becomes a morally acceptable option. First, there must be large-scale loss of life or ethnic cleansing. The intervention must be a proportional last resort. And of course, there must be a reasonable prospect of success. Yesterday, we had all sorts of interesting conceptual discussions of what success in war means. But in this context, success can be defined more simply as to refer to a positive humanitarian outcome. To be more specific, Taylor Seabolt puts it this way, and I'll quote him here. A humanitarian military intervention can be considered a success when it saves lives. To be more specific, if in a humanitarian crisis some people would have died without assistance, but did not die because of the actions of intervening military personnel, the intervention succeeded. Simple as that, right? So we do a bit of counterfactual analysis. You estimate how many people are reasonably likely to have been killed in the event of non-intervention. Then you tally up the number of people that were killed during and after the intervention. Then if one number is greater than the other, the humanitarian intervention succeeded on this model. The intervention resulted in there being fewer deaths, so there was a positive humanitarian outcome. Now, admittedly, these judgments, particularly the counterfactual, involves a considerable amount of speculation, but this is a more general problem and also a practical problem, so I'll put that aside for now. Now, I think we need to make at least one relatively minor adjustment to the concept of success in armed humanitarian intervention offered here by Seabolt. There's by now a consensus that things like forced expulsion or ethnic cleansing, as well as mass enslavement, these things can also justify humanitarian intervention. Now, while these kinds of atrocities typically do, they need not cause a spike in the mortality rate of the country in which they're occurring. If an intervention would prevent the expulsion of large numbers of people from their homes without reducing the number of deaths that are likely to have occurred in the absence of intervention, then on Seabolt's standard, the intervention would have to be deemed a failure, right? And this strikes me as counterintuitive, so I'll stipulate the following slightly modified definition of success in armed humanitarian intervention. We can say, if in a humanitarian crisis some people would have died or been enslaved or expelled without assistance, but did not die, or were not enslaved or expelled because of the actions of intervening military personnel, then the intervention succeeded. Okay. So that's just my working definition of success in humanitarian intervention. The International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, in line with just war theory, treats reasonable prospect of success as a threshold condition. That is, it's a requirement whose fulfillment is necessary for intervention to be justified. All right, so it's a necessary condition. But in addition to this, the report identifies two conditions which, though not strictly morally necessary, nevertheless are said to enhance the moral credentials of an armed humanitarian intervention. So they justify a more positive appraisal. So these two conditions are disinterest and multilateralism. Okay, so the report says that ideally an armed humanitarian intervention should be motivated purely by altruistic concern. So ulterior motives of an economic or geopolitical nature should be absent. In that sense, armed humanitarian intervention should be disinterested. And ideally, intervention should be multilateral, where the highest form of multilateralism is intervention carried out under the auspices of the United Nations Security Council. Okay, so those two things are put forward as ideals. Ideally, an intervention would have these characteristics, but it might nevertheless be justified even in certain circumstances when these ideals aren't met. So my question in this paper is this: what's the relationship between these two ideals and the threshold requirement of a reasonable prospect of success? I'm looking at the relationship between these two things. One suggestion, which I'm going to explore in this paper, is that the former, the ideals, can be seen as, or can be presumed to be in some way instrumental to the latter, instrumental to a reasonable prospect of success. That is, we should aspire towards disinterest and multilateralism because these things help to achieve or help to ensure that a positive humanitarian outcome is achieved, as I've just defined a positive humanitarian outcome. Now, if that's right, then the ideal conditions put forward by the Responsibility to Protect document, they can be partly grounded in or justified in reference to the success principle. Okay? So let me start with the arguments in support of this instrumentalist justification for the ideals of disinterest and multilateralism. The notion that humanitarian intervention ought to be disinterested has a long history. As early as in the 1800s, English jurist Sheldon Amos wrote that, quote, "So far as humanitarian intervention is concerned, it is above all desirable that the purity of the motive should be conspicuous." In a more recent restatement, Bhikkhu Parekh asserts that humanitarian intervention should be, quote, "wholly or primarily guided by the sentiment of humanity, compassion, or fellow feeling." Okay. Now, on the face of it, and this is, a lot of people have pointed this out, on the face of it, this seems kind of curious. Why do I say that? Well, because it seems as though motives, by themselves, don't have much bearing on the moral status of actions. So consider a simple case to illustrate this. A billionaire donates a large amount of money to charity. As a result of this charitable donation, many people that would have died of starvation or easily preventable disease, they don't die. Surely the billionaire has done a good thing. Okay? I think we can all agree on that. But now suppose we discover later that the billionaire had an ulterior motive all along. His donation was not at all motivated by sympathy or fellow feeling, but purely by a selfish desire to appear on the Forbes magazine list of most generous philanthropists or something. So it was completely selfish motive. Suppose he admits this in an interview with Forbes magazine or something like this. Now, this may lead us to think less of the philanthropist as a person. We might think, oh, what a jerk. But would we think less of the charitable act itself? Okay, surely it remains the case that the billionaire has done a very good thing. So the point here seems to be that selfish motives, they seem to taint the agent, but not the actions of the agent, at least not directly. So now the question becomes, why then should we concern ourselves with purity of motives in militarized charity in the form of armed humanitarian intervention, right? Why should we care? One suggestion is that if an intervention is contaminated by ulterior motives, it is likely that the conduct of the interveners will not be conducive to a positive humanitarian outcome. And the Kosovo campaign has been cited as a case in point here. So there's the Marxist historian Ellen Wood, and in her commentary on the Kosovo intervention, she admits that opponents of this intervention tended to shift between principled opposition to the intervention on the one hand, and practical opposition on the other hand. Practical opposition being opposition to the intervention only because it was poorly executed or bungled, is the word she uses. Right? So principled and practical opposition. Now Wood wants to say we can't really wrench these two things apart because she says, quote, "The bungling was inevitable simply because the war was driven by overriding motives quite distinct from and in opposition to its stated objectives." Right? So what she says is the real purpose of the war was to put on display NATO's military muscle and to force the Milosevic government to surrender to NATO unconditionally. It's not surprising then that NATO forces adopted a mode of warfare that best served these ends: high-tech, high-altitude, highly destructive bombing.
Ned, who was that writer again?
Alan Wood. Alan Makeson's Wood. I'm not sure if I've pronounced the middle name correctly. So they had these ulterior motives. That's why they adopted this particular mode of warfare. But this particular mode of warfare proved disastrous for the very people that the war was ostensibly waged to protect. So the motive, the selfish motive, had a bad influence on conduct, and conduct undermined good humanitarian outcomes. There's an Australian philosopher, Peter Coughlin, who argues that American interests had a very similar effect on the recent Iraq War. And he identifies three distinct motives behind the decision to invade. The first was a punitive motive, to take revenge against the terrorist cells that attacked New York and Washington on September 11. The second was a deterrent motive. It was to show off the military strength of the US, and with this to send a message to potential threats. The third motive was to liberate the Iraqi people. This was the humanitarian motive. Right? Now, what Coughlin says is that the first and the second motives undermine the achievement of the third, or the fulfillment of the third. So he says US forces may have wanted to help the Iraqi people, but they largely failed in this objective, predictably so, because they were so determined, quote, to kick some ass along the way, in line with the first two objectives. Right, so the implication here in these arguments is that disinterest is instrumentally valuable. Without it, an intervention can't be expected to achieve a positive humanitarian outcome because motives affect conduct and conduct affects consequences. That's why we should care about motives in militarized charity. Right? Now, you've got similar instrumentalist type arguments for multilateralism, for the second ideal that I mentioned. And here I'll sketch three of the most commonly recurring. The first argument goes via the argument for disinterest. And Eric Hines puts it this way. He says, if an incident of humanitarian suffering is large-scale and severe enough to permit military intervention, then arriving at operational decisions collectively is the best means of ensuring that a particular state does not exploit the situation for its own ends to the detriment of a humanitarian outcome. In other words, multilateralism most fully realized when intervention is carried out under the banner of the United Nations. This helps to weed out ulterior motives. This is a procedure that weeds out ulterior motives, and that's important because ulterior motives can obstruct humanitarian outcomes. A second instrumentalist argument for multilateralism goes roughly like this. One of the main impediments to success in humanitarian intervention is resistance from within the target society. And Walzer observed long ago that some measure of resistance is always to be expected without any exceptions. The resistance is likely to be all the more fierce and widespread and protracted when the local population is hostile to or suspicious of the intervening power. As a researcher at the Brookings Institute once said, if you don't trust the messenger, you don't trust the message, even if it's a good one. Right? Now, the involvement of a multiplicity of parties, this argument goes, helps to mitigate this distrust and animosity towards the interveners, who must win hearts and minds in order to be successful ultimately. There is a great deal of antagonism towards those states most inclined to engage in intervention unilaterally, such as the US. This can be expected to aggravate the resistance to any unilateral intervention, which increases the risk of mission failure. The claim is that a multilateral effort will not arouse the same suspicion and resentment, and in this respect at least, multilateral authority improves an intervention's prospect of success. In this connection, perhaps for good reason, the UN Security Council is held up as the ideal especially strongly. The Security Council is comprised of 5 permanent members, 10 non-permanent elected members, always including representatives from Europe, Africa, Asia and the Americas, all of the major races and religions, large and small countries, capitalist and non-capitalist economies, democratic and non-democratic polities, all represented. The thought is that local populations on the receiving end of an armed humanitarian intervention are likely to be more receptive to a humanitarian intervention that is carried out by an organisation that is in this way representative of humanity, rather than a state or coalition with its own parochial character and interests and checkered history. All right, so that's the second instrumentalist argument for multilateralism. Finally, this is sort of the most basic point that comes up again and again in the literature. Multilateralism helps to distribute the costs and risks associated with intervention, which makes it more politically and economically sustainable for those that are prosecuting it. This is important because, the argument goes, intervention is unlikely to achieve anything lasting if the interveners are compelled by domestic pressure to withdraw in a hurry. Right? If the underlying issues that triggered the rights abuses to begin with are not dealt with in any way, when the interveners move out, then there's a good chance that the rights abuses will simply resume. So the rights abuses will not have been prevented or ended as per the aim of humanitarian intervention. Rather, they would have just been suspended or postponed, which isn't success in any meaningful sense. And Edward Luttwak, if anyone's read the paper, famous paper in Foreign Affairs, Give War a Chance, this is a point that he drives home particularly strongly. So, the idea here is that a lasting positive humanitarian outcome will often demand some sort of continued presence, peacekeeping or something like that, maybe even nation building, and multilateralism helps to facilitate this by distributing costs and risks. It facilitates it politically. Okay, so these are the bare bones of the instrumentalist arguments for the ideals of disinterest and multilateralism. They say that these ideals are important because that they are in some way conducive to a positive humanitarian outcome. If we're concerned about success, we should be concerned about these things instrumentally because they can be expected to contribute to it. Now, I think all of these arguments do have some merit, but the important question for me is, are we justified in generalizing or even weakly presuming that an intervention that lives up to these ideals has a stronger prospect of success? Can we generalize or presume that that's the case, like as a rule? And I'm going to suggest that the answer, unfortunately, is probably not. Okay, while disinterest and multilateralism might sometimes, in some ways, improve an intervention's prospect of success, these things can equally be expected to function as impediments to success. Okay. So I thought I'd start by revisiting some of the forecasts made by classical realist thinkers in the 1950s, and I'm going to concentrate on Hans Morgenthau because I think he's such an eloquent writer and really captures the points quite well. So Morgenthau was once described as the godfather of classical realism, and he warned against what he called sentimentalism in foreign policy for a number of interlocking reasons. And I'll draw attention to the two most relevant to this discussion. First, Morgenthau argued that states lack both the will and the resources to pursue what he called altruistic doctrines to a satisfactory completion. These doctrines, he said, are only ever implemented, quote, in fits and starts, here half-heartedly and with insufficient means, there with all-out military commitments, there not at all. Consequently, the national interest is set back, and there is no humanitarian benefit sufficient to offset this cost. So I'll quote him, political success is sacrificed without appreciable gain in universal morality. Right? So Morgenthau is here, he's making a realist prescription based on a realist description. Since states are not, as a matter of fact, endlessly altruistic, they just shouldn't bother dabbling in altruism. It doesn't do anybody any good. If Morgenthau's right, then disinterest is likely to undermine the success of an armed humanitarian intervention. Paradoxically then, the more closely an intervention approximates this ideal, the more likely it is to fall short of a threshold requirement and therefore to be unjustified. Okay? Now, recent historical and some social scientific evidence suggests that Morgenthau may have been onto something. And I'm just going to take you through some of this social scientific evidence. I probably don't need to, but I just figure it's kind of interesting anyway. Since the end of the Second World War, Western publics have grown gradually less tolerant of military casualties on their own side. And this is sometimes called the casualty aversion phenomenon. And a number of influences are said to be at work here. The first is demographics. Many countries, especially Western countries, have fewer children per couple than at any other time in their history. In the 19th century, it was not uncommon for children to die as a result of illness or accident or war, but families were generally much larger, and this to some extent compensated for the loss of any one child. Now that families have on average 2 children or fewer, each one is expected to survive into adulthood, and each embodies a larger share of the family's emotional economy. An understandable byproduct of this is greater parental resistance to military engagement and lesser tolerance for casualties. So that's the first factor in play. The second is that the population is also aging. The baby boomers have just about reached retirement age, and modern medicine is keeping more people alive for longer. 30 years from now, the proportion of the world's population aged over 65 will grow from around 15% today to around 30%. What this means is that an ever smaller segment of the population is engaged productively in the workforce, paying taxes and shouldering the burden of caring for the rest. Okay, sending these individuals to war deprives their respective economies of much needed productive services, at least temporarily. Casualty aversion is in part a response to the economic and social imperative to avoid further depletion of our scarce human resources. The decline of religion in the West is also believed to have made matters worse in this connection, in connection to the casualty aversion phenomenon. The thought is that young people are less likely to be willing to sacrifice this life if they believe that this life is the only life that they're going to get, right? So military recruitment and retention has therefore become increasingly difficult with the decline of religion, and this in turn has impacted upon the military's readiness to risk soldiers' lives. Finally, and this was the most interesting point, I think, the advent of the all-volunteer force is thought to have contributed to casualty aversion. Where military service is compulsory, as long as it is properly enforced and administered, the costs of war are seen as being shared among all classes and social groups. In an all-volunteer military, on the other hand, the poor and minority groups tend to be overrepresented. This is why some critics call the all-volunteer force a poverty draft. If you've heard this expression, it's conscription by desperation. Now, the military sociologist Charles Moskos shows that the degree to which a community is willing to accept casualties in war depends in part on whether the children of social elites are perceived to be bearing their fair share of the costs and risks. So the perception that the costs of war are not distributed equitably under an all-volunteer arrangement makes the community less tolerant of military casualties. All right, so that's just some of the social science research. It tells us that all of these factors are contributing to casualty aversion. But, importantly, the research also reveals that there's an exception to this casualty aversion phenomenon. As long as vital national interests are seen to be at stake, Western publics are prepared, and some say as prepared as ever, to sacrifice the lives of the young men and women. Right? In other words, these various influences that I just talked about, they produce casualty aversion only in the context of perceived political disinterest. There have been occasions in recent history where this arguably produced exactly the kinds of adverse consequences that Morgenthau warned of in the 50s. Right? So on at least one occasion, casualty aversion, which comes with disinterest, impeded the success of a humanitarian operation, and it did so by effecting a premature withdrawal. And I'm talking about Operation Restore Hope in Somalia as the most obvious case. The humanitarian crisis in 1992 had little perceived bearing on US national interests, but the situation attracted so much media coverage that when President Bush Sr. resolved to take action, a New York Times poll showed that he had the support of 81% of the American public at that time. That was until October 1993, when US soldiers were ambushed in Mogadishu and 18 Rangers were killed. Pictures of their mutilated corpses were broadcast back into American households, the public demanded withdrawal, and the government duly obliged. So casualty aversion cut the intervention shorter than it should have been, and as a consequence, Operation Restore Hope is often to be found on the list of unsuccessful humanitarian interventions. Of course, this is not the only way that political disinterest has impeded success. Recall Alan Wood's explanation for why the Kosovo intervention had a suboptimal result. She says the campaign was limited to high-altitude bombing, which only made things worse, because this is what best served the selfish ulterior motives of NATO's member states. That's her explanation. But an equally plausible explanation is that this method of war was adopted precisely because NATO states had no strategic or economic interest at stake. This made a ground assault politically unfeasible, since democratic citizens have shown themselves to be unwilling to tolerate military casualties purely for the sake of defending foreign nationals. So on this occasion, the purity of the humanitarian motive, the disinterest, may have been what undermined the humanitarian outcome, not by effecting premature withdrawal on this occasion, but by leading to the adoption of methods of war that were not well suited to achieving a humanitarian objective. How am I going for time? Okay? 5. Okay. Let me return for a minute to the classical realists. Morgenthau thought that take an altruistic agent and give him a gun, and that's a recipe for disaster. He says, and I'll quote him again, I can't resist, "The moral disease of the crusading spirit in politics generates violent abominations unknown to less moralistic but more politically minded ages." And I think Morgenthau's identified a legitimate danger here, and I'm not the first person to say this. The worry in relation to humanitarian intervention is this: the more soldiers see themselves as the defenders of justice and good and civilization, as opposed to mundane national interests, the more likely they may be to simplify the moral boundaries of the conflict and to perceive the enemy as the embodiment of injustice and evil and barbarism, as an opponent that is not deserving of the respect that is usually owed to the enemy. As a result, disinterested military conflict may be conducted with greater savagery and ruthlessness. An acute awareness of the self-serving nature of a military operation can help to prevent the enemy from being demonized and dehumanized in a way that threatens to undermine positive humanitarian outcomes. And this is a point that's driven home by Anthony Coates in particular. So really all I'm saying is this: it's not a big claim. Disinterest can impede success, sometimes. So can multilateralism. Right? That's my next big point, for several reasons. First, a rapid response is crucial to the success of most any humanitarian intervention. Take the Rwandan genocide as the obvious example. Approximately 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus killed in the space of 100 days. That's 10,000 murders for every day, 400 per hour, 7 per minute, for every minute at the negotiating table. Right? Now, since a UN mandate comes via negotiation and deliberation, it invariably brings these kinds of delays which can't be afforded in this context. In cases where the UN insists on prosecuting intervention under its own command, the delays tend to be exacerbated. And this is partly because the UN doesn't have a standing army, not yet anyway. It therefore needs to raise a military force from scratch on every occasion. It must cobble together whatever troops and equipment its member states are willing to offer. In addition to this, coming back to Siebold, who I started with, he suggests that the soldiers provided to the UN as part of any such multilateral operation will tend to be undertrained and poorly equipped. The UN, he says, is extremely sensitive to maintaining political balance and fair representation of the different regions of the world. And earlier I said that this might enhance prospects of success by making it easier to win hearts and minds. But at the same time, Siebold suggests that this prevents the UN from selecting mission personnel purely on the basis of their qualifications and abilities. So he writes, many UN mission personnel are highly dedicated and good at their jobs, but many are not, making UN operations militarily weaker than those of voluntary coalitions. I've got one more point here, which is just that a commitment to multilateralism can run contrary to basic military understandings of unified command, which can impede the efficacious use of power, but I'll skip over this. So my point is just this. In some ways, realizing the ideals of multilateralism can be expected to compromise an intervention's prospect of success. And to the political realist, this won't come as a surprise. Again, Morgenthau says that international institutions and their legalistic exercises do, quote, nothing at all to advance international peace. So let me be clear on what I'm saying. I'm not making a generalization that the ideals of disinterest and multilateralism obstruct positive humanitarian outcomes. My claim is weaker and sadly much less interesting, which is that we can't generalize that these ideals promote a positive humanitarian outcome. In fact, I don't think we're even justified in presuming that as a rule the fulfillment of these ideals will make humanitarian success more likely. There may be some reason to believe that disinterest and multilateralism enhance prospects of success, but there is also reason to believe, and in my estimation, equally compelling reason to believe, that these ideals can diminish prospects of success. Now, if I'm right about this, it doesn't necessarily mean that the ideals I've been talking about, disinterest and multilateralism, cannot be justified and ought to be discarded. I'm not getting to that conclusion, but it does mean that the success principle cannot be relied upon to do any of the justificatory work, as some folks have suggested that it might be. Right? Entirely different justifications for the ideals are needed. Neither can be grounded in or defended in reference to prospects of success. Now, the trouble to my mind is that many of the alternative justifications available for these ideals are rather flimsy as well. But alas, I don't have the time to get into that today. For now, I'm content saying that one of the most normatively powerful reasons we might have for aspiring towards the ideals of disinterest and multilateralism, namely that they contribute to positive humanitarian outcomes, this reason doesn't work in the real world because it rests on dubious empirical generalizations and perhaps a little bit of idealistic wishful thinking. I suspect this might strike many of you as fairly obvious. It certainly struck me as fairly obvious, but I still felt the need to say it. So thanks for your tolerance.